This video is sponsored by Adaptroll. More about them later on. The 6th Legion of the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Wolves, are known for their melee prowess, keen senses, and enhanced speed. Named the Emperor's Executioners, they are adept at hunting down the enemies of the Imperium, using a variety of, shall we say, non-standard tactics. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another Getting Started in Warhammer 40k video, this time for the Space Wolves chapter. In this video, we'll be discussing constructing an army from the Space Wolves chapter, the core abilities of the army, as well as constructing a force from a combat patrol all the way up through incursion and strike force games, as well as basic strategies to use when utilizing this army on the battlefield. Now, first of all, it's important to talk about Space Marines as a whole. Space Wolves are a Space Marine chapter, meaning that they adopt some basic mechanics from their parent faction, most notably their army ability Oath of Moment. This gives you the opportunity to choose an enemy unit in your command phase at the start of your turn, gaining full hit rerolls targeting that enemy for the remainder of the round, as well as sometimes some additional benefits based on what units are attacking. Now, generally speaking, you will also gain a +1 to wound effect. However, that's not available for all Space Marine chapters, and Space Wolves are unfortunately one of the ones that do not gain access to this enhanced version of Oaths of Moment. This is because Space Wolves are what we call a Codex non-compliant chapter. This gives them access to an entire additional supplement of rules, which is included in the Space Wolves Codex, which you use alongside the Space Marine Codex. So you still have access to all detachments and units inside the Space Marine Codex, but in exchange for an enhanced version of Oath of Moment, you are able to access new detachments as well as powerful new units, special abilities, and characters. Now, this is all unlocked by the chapter keyword. Space Marines are unique in Warhammer 40k in that they have two faction keywords, the Adeptus Astartes keyword, as well as a special chapter keyword. When you're constructing your army, you will choose one chapter keyword to use. This unlocks all units and detachments that use that special keyword. However, it restricts you from taking all units and detachments that do not belong to that keyword. So, for example, we can choose to play Space Wolves, which gives us access to characters like Logan Grimnir and Arjak Rockfist, as well as units like Wolfguard Headtakers and detachments like Saga of the Beast Slayer. However, we are not able to take any units with the Blood Angels keyword, or any detachments like Liberator Assault Group that requires that we come from the Blood Angels chapter. Now, Space Wolves are further unique in this way in that a lot of their effects will be restricted to only Space Wolf units. This is a little confusing because you would assume that all of your units in a Space Wolf's army are Space Wolf units, but that's not correct. These effects only reference units that have the Space Wolf chapter keyword on their datasheet. That, generally speaking, means that they will only impact Space Wolf unique units that hail directly from the Codex supplement. So, for example, if an effect requires that you are a Space Wolf unit to benefit from it, it will only affect units like Wolfguard Headtakers, Bloodclaws, Grey Hunters, and Wolfguard Terminators, for example, units that come from the Codex supplement. It will not affect units like standard Terminator squads, Blade Guard veterans, or Tactical Marines that come from the Space Marine Codex, even though those might be in a Space Wolves army. This is very confusing, and Space Wolves are one of the only factions in the game that utilizes sub-factions in this way. Generally speaking, keywords will only just refer to their main army keyword, but Space Wolves have a lot of effects that check very specifically that they are referencing only their specialist units. This video is sponsored by Adaptroll. Adaptroll's been a huge supporter of the channel for a while, so I'm excited to talk about them and their new updates. For those who don't know, this is a dice probability calculator app that can give you quick and easy access to expected dice results at your fingertips. So if you're wondering about particular unit builds, or you want to know what the best course of action in a particular game state might be, you can use Adaptroll to very quickly
get those results by importing unit profiles and quickly spitting out expected damage. This can help you smooth your army list building or give you insights into the game. And their latest update takes into account a ton of player feedback, improving things like unit profile imports, making it easier to import your datasheets and their weapon stats into the dice calculator, a full modifier and ability section to more easily input all types of attacker and defender special rules, a wider selection of results to grant you a deeper understanding of the results, as well as a new text summary to more easily understand the math you're looking at in English. So follow the links down in the video description to get access to Adapt Roll today. And big thanks to them for sponsoring the video.
Now, with that out of the way, let's move on and talk about some army construction. We're going to start by discussing the Space Wolf Combat Patrol. I always recommend that players, when they're getting into a faction or getting into the game, start with a combat patrol because it is an intended entry point into the game and it gives you a cohesive army to play. Now, the Space Wolf Combat Patrol is composed of a single Wolf Guard battle leader, 10 Blood Claws, 5 Wolfen, and 5 Wolf Guard Terminators. Now, this is very melee-oriented. However, these are units that are going to be able to scale up to larger game sizes pretty well. So overall, this tends to be a fairly solid combat patrol. Now, when you're assembling these, I would almost always assemble the Wolfen as Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Wolfen. They give you a good melee anti-tank option, which is something that Space Wolves kind of are sorely lacking in a lot of instances. I would also recommend that you assemble your Terminators with Storm Shields and Mastercrafted Power Weapons rather than their Stormbolter option. The Stormbolter Terminators, unfortunately, are relatively underpowered. However, these guys are a very good melee tank. So being able to improve their survivability with those Storm Shields is important. Now, once you have a couple games under your belt, it's time to talk about Incursion level gameplay. This is the first standard game format that we're going to discuss and requires that we talk about some of the more regular army building rules in Warhammer 40,000. Incursion level games are made up of 1,000 points. It's about double what you would get in a combat patrol, and you have to choose a detachment in order to play. Now, the detachment that I recommend basically all new Space Marine players use is Gladius Task Force. This is because it's the most flexible detachment and shores up a lot of the weaknesses of some core Space Wolf units. One downside that Space Wolf units have, while they tend to be relatively high damage, is that their strength characteristics are relatively low. And having access to the stratagem Honor the Chapter is incredibly important. This gives you Lance, so +1 to wound on the charge, as well as access to +1 AP, allowing you to get your relatively low strength characteristic, high damage melee attacks actually converting into high toughness enemies so that your melee units can actually kill big vehicles and things. Space Wolves as a whole, on most of their basic units, are incredibly good at clearing infantry, even medium 2 wound infantry or heavy 3+ wound infantry with multi-damage attacks. However, they are not very good at punching through heavy armor. So Honor the Chapter is almost required in this case. You also get access to combat doctrines, which allow you to open up your swathe of abilities a little bit more flexibly. You can do things like advance and shoot with Devastator Doctrine, advance and charge with Assault Doctrine, and even switch between doctrines using adaptive strategy. So with that, we are going to build a well-rounded army into the Incursion game size, incorporating a pair of Ballistus Dreadnoughts, Arjak Rockfist, the epic hero character who can wildly improve the damage output of our Terminator unit, as well as a unit of 5 scouts and a unit of 5 intercessors. These guys are going to be acting as objective scorers and utility. So in upgrading from the Combat Patrol to the Incursion list, there's a couple things that we have to keep in mind. Now, first of all, the Combat Patrol itself is incredibly melee-oriented, but Space Wolves tend to play a little bit more of a combined arms strategy, where they want to take some long-range shooting in order to shore up their weaknesses with anti-tank and melee, and then also use that to support coming into melee with their melee units. So to that end, we are adding these Ballistus Dreadnoughts. These guys operate relatively independently of other support because they can gain their own hit rerolls when targeting enemies that are above half of their starting strength. This is a powerful ability because it's very difficult not to trigger. Essentially, it checks when you target the unit, so whether or not you deal damage to them doesn't matter. So as long as your opponent has half or more of their remaining wounds when the Ballistus Dreadnought selects them as a target, they're going to be gaining those wound rerolls. So these guys basically don't need the effect of Oaths of Moment to operate normally. They can just wander around and shoot at things, and most of the time they get hit rerolls, which is great. From there, what we want to do is construct a situation where the opponent has to come to you in order to fight you. We need some utility units in order to do that. That includes a unit of Space Marine Scouts. I think for Space Wolves, in the current setting, having one heavy weapon Space Marine Scout to give you an extra missile launcher shot is good, and then otherwise I would be equipping them with melee weapons here, because a lot of the army is going to be stuck in melee at some point. We then have an Intercessor Squad. These guys are going to be able to hang out in the back line. They have objective secured, so when they hold an objective at the start of your turn, they lock it in under your control, and you can then leave it and go do other things. So these guys can, in the early game, lock in your home objective under your control, and then you can use them as either a shooting unit to clear infantry or as a utility unit to go and perform some actions and things like that. From there, we are also adding Arjak Rockfist, the character. Now, his effect here is not necessarily for his leadership ability. His leadership ability is actually relatively bad. However, he himself is really good at fighting. So he's going to be coming in here in order to grant the Wolfguard Terminators a little bit stronger of a melee profile when it comes to knocking down vehicles. They can clear infantry just fine. They have a pretty strong suite of anti-infantry melee attacks with their 2 damage mastercrafted power weapons, but they are only strength 5 AP2. So when you're coming into heavy armor, especially T10 or higher, you really need some extra oomph in order to crack through those profiles, and Arjak Rockfist brings that. They will also protect him because the unit's very difficult to kill. They are -1 to be wounded as long as you are attacking with higher than their toughness characteristic, which is most heavy infantry sweepers in the game. And if you are equipping their Storm Shield as opposed to their Storm Bolter, they have 4 wounds apiece. So it's a ton of wounds. Most of it is -1 to be wounded. You can combo that with stratagems like Armor of Contempt to give the enemies -1 armor penetration when targeting them, which is great with a 2+ save unit. And these guys become legitimately difficult to shift, which means Arjak Rockfist just gets more of his attacks out over the course of the game. Lastly, we are likely going to be attaching our Wolfguard Battle Leader into our Blood Claws here. These guys will advance and charge all the time, which is great. They don't necessarily need to use Assault Doctrine in order to gain advance and charge. However, we will likely want to use it because the unit has a lot of kind of low value melee attacks, which means it really wants Honor the Chapter to be able to do some damage. And another benefit here is that the Wolfguard Battle Leader grants reroll 1s to hit to the unit as well as sustained hits, which means they don't necessarily need Oaths of Moment in order to operate normally. So between these guys and the Ballistus Dreadnoughts, neither of these profiles really need Oaths of Moment, which means we can Oath of Moment whatever's being attacked by the Wolfen, for example. They all, I guess ironically, also have reroll once they hit baked in because of their death totems. But these guys are going to be equipped with the Storm Shield and a 2-handed weapon, which makes them good against vehicles. So they're another anti-vehicle melee unit. And they are, in fairness, basically the Space Wolf anti-vehicle melee option. So they're a good counterpunch to clear out vehicles, whereas the Wolfguard Terminators and the Blood Claws are a little bit better at dealing with infantry. But whichever unit we need to put down in melee, we can usually target with Oath of Moment. And then most of the other units have other ways to mitigate a lack of Oaths of Moment, a lack of built-in rerolls. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the battlefield, you really kind of have to internalize the strategy of the counter-attack. That's something that Space Wolves traditionally are adept at in the lore. They spring traps on their opponents, and that's kind of what you want to do on the table as well. A lot of their infantry, especially things like Blood Claws, are not particularly fast melee units. Now, an interesting piece about Space Wolves is that their unique units tend to be faster than regular Space Marine units, but only by an inch or two of movement. So while they are better at closing the distance than a standard Space Marine army is, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have a super long threat range. So the units like these, what you want to do is find a position in the center of the table where they can hide and threaten the opponent's half of the battlefield. You're not necessarily going to be running them forward into the line of fire because they'll most likely die, but what you want to do is hide them, especially behind ruins and other terrain features that are near the center of the table. If you're in this position and you have access to Assault Doctrine, so advance and charge, you can move 7 inches for your base movement, plus an advance gives you around a 10-inch movement characteristic, plus a charge. Average charge is around 7 inches, so you can assume that between like 14 and maybe 18-ish inches is the danger zone for your opponent. So suddenly, if we are in this position, we can threaten into our opponent's deployment zone and make it so that if they attack any of these objectives, we can counterattack with that Bloodclaw unit. So that's going to be a big part of the strategy here. Now, you do need to ensure that the opponent is required to move up and attack into those positions. The Space Marine Scouts and your other forward operators are going to be a big part of that. These guys are going to be wandering around. They do have both Scout and Infiltrate, so they're going to be able to deploy up in forward areas like this. And then when we determine who goes first, they can then move. So an important thing to do is to give them a good, safe position to deploy in, and then essentially assure they can scout to that position. So this building is relatively safe, especially from a lot of these side angles. So we want to deploy the scouts out in front of it. This way, if you go first, they can go and they can do actions on the objective. They can move to attack or to try to hold this objective, for example. However, if you go second, they're in a position where they can simply run back and hide behind this wall, and you're not going to lose them turn 1. Then you can move them out to either score secondary objectives or to try to hold this objective, maybe with an advance on a future turn. That's going to force your opponent to reciprocate, move up and try to attack those guys. Then you get things like these blood claws that can stage into this position, move out, and counterattack them. Now, so the scouts are going to be an important part of that strategy. The other thing is this unit of Wolfguard Terminators. Now, I would basically all 100% of the time start the Wolfguard Terminators in reserve. They do have the deep strike ability, so they're able to start the game in reserve. They count towards your 50% of your army reserves limit, but not your 25% strategic reserves limit, which is nice. And then we can use rapid ingress on them. So this is a very powerful stratagem for deep striking units. It allows you to deploy them at the end of your opponent's movement phase rather than the end of your own movement phase. So you can see where your opponent has moved to try to attack, then you can place these guys down and then move to attack them yourself. Especially in incursion games where there's not a ton of screening units to prevent you from coming in places. Units like these are really powerful. So let's assume that your opponent's, moved up to attack here. You have an opportunity to counterattack them with blood claws. And potentially they're hiding in this ruin or they're hiding on their home objective. You then use rapid ingress to place the Wolfguard Terminators, hopefully not in a position where they can shoot them. Use Assault Doctrine to give your whole army advance and charge. And suddenly we have all of these Terminators pushing right up into the heart of your opponent's army, and hopefully Arjak Rockfist gets down and dirty and starts banging stuff down with his hammer. Now, if your opponent is not engaging in that way, we can poke at them with the Ballistus Dreadnoughts. One thing you can consider is putting one Ballistus Dreadnought in strategic reserve to come off a table edge and get shots if you don't otherwise have it. Otherwise, they're relatively independent. They can kind of just maneuver around by themselves and take shots where you have them. They're also relatively resilient as ranged vehicles go. The Space Marine Dreadnought profile tends to be kind of hard to kill, so they can move up and sort of sit on objectives. I wouldn't put them in the line of sight of your opponent's entire army, but one or two enemy guns usually won't take them out in one turn, and then you get to reciprocate with both of your Ballistus Dreadnoughts and hopefully kill them. So they can either start in reserve or sort of activate, operate independently, and try to clip out enemy units that are taking objectives or performing actions without having to commit any of your big powerful bricks like your Wolfguard Terminators or your Blood Claws. From there we have the Wolfen. The Wolfen are a little bit of an odd wolf person out, I guess. They're another unit that could go in strategic reserve and then rapid ingress onto the table later on, which is good. They're also relatively fast, so you can use them to stage into additional positions, kind of like the Blood Claws. They aren't as good at killing infantry, but they are very good at killing vehicles. So if your opponent is vehicle-oriented, you can try to set them up on a flank where your opponent does have vehicles, and then use them to stage, wait for your Assault Doctrine to come active, and then they become extremely fast. Their base movement characteristic is very high, so they're going to be able, with an advance and charge, to threaten a pretty long distance and hopefully knock out a tank. The ideal situation for Space Marines is for all of these things to kind of collide at the same time. So if you can set up a situation where your opponent is in charge range of your Wolfen, has something that your Blood Claws can charge, and then you also rapid ingress Arjak Rockfist's unit into a juicy position to attack them, then you can expose your Ballistus Dreadnoughts, get a full round of shooting, and put your entire army in to attack your opponent. It's usually termed like a go turn or a push turn. You then expose your whole army to them, but they likely, especially after receiving a hit from you, don't have the capacity to kill everything, and you can sort of bowl them over from there. That's the ideal situation. Most good opponents will try to prevent you from getting a perfect go turn like that. However, if you are utilizing your scouts to force them to move forward and staging in these positions without, getting hit yourself, then you're going to be able to set that up potentially, especially in these smaller game styles. You can also, in the early game, if you need the Ballistus Dreadnoughts to get line of sight to things, you can use Devastator Doctrine to give them advance and shoot. Your other units don't necessarily need that, so ripping Devastator Doctrine off early also makes these guys particularly strong. You also get an enhanced version of Storm of Fire if you do that. They gain Ignore Cover and +1 AP for 1 command point, which is an incredible buff. And especially because their AP values are kind of mediocre, that's one downside of the Ballistic Dreadnought. That is essentially +2 AP, because Ignore Cover usually is equivalent to +1 AP. And that allows these guys to go absolutely pop off. So if there's a turn early where you can get good shots with Ballistic Dreadnoughts, if you advance Devastator Doctrine, definitely use that early. But then once you're stuck in, just start to use Tactical Doctrine on future battle rounds, on rounds 3, 4 onwards, to pull your units out of melee and then recharge back in to ensure you don't get stuck in ongoing combats. Or obviously with the Ballistic Dreadnoughts, they can use Tactical Doctrine to pull out of melee and then shoot back at the units that were engaging them. One of the reasons that Gladius Task Force is so good, and so especially recommended for new players, is that it's so flexible. It gives you all of those options to get out of those situations when you need to. Now from there, we're going to move on to a Strike Force game, a full-sized game of Warhammer 40k. And we're going to do a couple things that we don't usually do here in the Getting Started series, and that's kind of recontextualize how we use a lot of these units. Now, this is going to be a doubling of the size of the Incursion, and a lot of times what we're doing is adding either additional support for the stuff we already have, or additional unit size to the units that we are already taking. So in this case, some easy additions are an additional Ballistic Dreadnought. For all the reasons we talked about before, these guys are efficient, they're hard to kill, they are able to shoot things without needing oaths of moment. It's great. We're also going to be increasing the size of both of our Wolfguard Terminators, so I recommend another 5 of those. As I mentioned before, I recommend you take Storm Shields on these guys. I did not mention before, but they do have an Assault Cannon option as well. That the Assault Cannon is also pretty strong, and it gives you another high impact melee attack inside the unit, as well as the Relic Great Axe on the unit Champion. That's also a pretty good option as well. It does knock the Storm Shields off those models, so they are slightly easier to kill, but you get a pair of not terrible guns with devastating wounds and a couple of higher strength melee attacks, which is always good to go alongside Arjak Rockfist's attack. We're also then taking 20 Blood Claws. These guys will essentially be another one of our big punching melee units. We're also adding an additional Scout Squad as well, for all the reasons we talked about before, and I think the loadout of your 2 Scout Squads should be the same. We're also adding a couple new units. This includes an Incursor Squad. This is another forward operating unit that can support your ranged attacks, as well as a unit called Wolfguard Headtakers. Now, the Headtakers over here are a Space Wolf's unique unit. These guys are an equivalent to sort of Blade Guard veterans. They're kind of an elite melee unit. Again, they run into the Space Wolf problem of being relatively low strength. They're only strength 5 in melee. However, they do have the option to get extra melee attacks over what something like a Blade Guard veteran could. So they have the option to either take a 4+ invulnerable save from a Storm Shield, or they can get 6 melee attacks by taking paired weapons. I personally like the paired weapons because I think we're going to use these guys as kind of a one-hit wonder. They're a big nuclear missile that can run in. However, both options are basically equally viable. So however you feel like taking them, if you want the additional survivability so they can fight in prolonged combats better, that's also good, but the additional attacks let them hit harder the first time they go in. So either one of those is strong. Now, in this case, we are going to attach the Wolfguard Battle Leader into the unit. This is one of the reasons that the Space Wolf specific keywords are very important, because Wolfguard Battle Leaders can only attach to Space Wolf units. They have no non-Space Wolf specific unit leadership options. So they cannot go in things like Assault Intercessors or into Blade Guard veterans. They must go into units like Grey Hunters, or in this case, like Wolfguard. However, their benefit for Wolfguard is great. They give rerolls and they give sustained hits, which, especially if you're swinging with that 6 attack profile, is a ton of additional damage. Again, it is all only at strength 5, so you do need Auto the Chapter most of the time to knock into big stuff, but once they get that, it's a huge volume of melee attacks, and they're going to be able to do some damage. They also have some interesting abilities. They can choose an enemy unit to gain precision and devastating wounds against at the start of the game, and then each time that unit's killed, they choose another one to cycle down through the army. This helps shore up their relatively low strength and AP values. Devastating wounds gives you mortal wounds instead of normal damage on a wound roll of a 6. It's not the greatest thing here ever. It is good if you have the high volume attacks because you have a lot of chances to roll 6s. However, in many cases, you're looking for wound rerolls or something in order to get more of those devastating effects. In this case, we're just fishing for 6s, but it's good to chunk, I don't know, probably 4 to 6 damage through most save profiles without them having the chance to save, which is a nice benefit. The important thing to keep in mind is that this only affects, and I've actually done this wrong myself, it only affects the Wolfguard Headtakers in the unit. It does not affect the unit itself. So if you have a character like the Wolfguard Battle Leader attached in, he will not gain devastating wounds. Only the unit will. However, he will contribute his rerolls and sustained hits to those attacks. So he gives them his ability, but it doesn't work in reverse, specifically for head takers because of how the ability is worded. Now, head takers are also very unique. They're actually not a unit of 6, they're a unit of 12. Because we have these 6 hunting wolves that come alongside them inside the pack. Now, the hunting wolves can be taken basically at equal numbers to the head taker unit. And at the start of the battle, before you declare your battle formations, they separate into 2 separate units. The hunting wolves don't get any benefits from the special abilities or anything. However, they are just a very inexpensive way to get another unit on the battlefield. So these guys can bring dogs with them, and the dogs can act as a very fast utility unit. They can screen. They can, in some cases, hold objectives. We'll talk about that in a sec. They can perform actions. They can perform maneuver secondaries. They can run around, and they can, sometimes engage enemies. They're just a insanely inexpensive unit option. So you have the option, if you want to save points, not to play these guys, but I almost always recommend that you do because they're so inexpensive and it's such a good deal. Now, the hunting wolves do have a downside, which is that their objective control characteristic is 0. This means that they cannot hold objectives by themselves and they cannot perform actions to score secondary objectives, which would make them a mediocre unit. However, they have the hunting hounds ability, which says that if they're within 6 inches of a space wolf character, again, here's another instance where the space wolf keyword is really important. It only checks for characters that are from your supplement. So if they're, for example, they're next to a Phobos Lieutenant, they will not gain any benefit from this ability. However, if they're next to, let's say, Ragnar Blackmane, who is a Space Wolf character with the Space Wolf chapter keyword, they will gain this benefit. In this case, all of our characters are Space Wolf characters, so that's not really a huge downside. However, it is important to keep in mind. So if they're within 6 inches of one of our Space Wolf characters, they gain an objective control characteristic of 1 as long as they're not battle shocked, which means that what we can do is try to trail these models back to a character. So by way of example, let's say that, for example, our hunting wolves are trying to perform a secondary or complete a secondary that says, get within 3 inches of the center of the battlefield. So by way of example, let's say that our hunting wolves are trying to complete a secondary that says, hold the objective in the middle of the battlefield, or establish locus in the center within 6 inches of the middle. Normally, they wouldn't be able to perform actions because they're OC 0. However, as long as the unit is within 6 inches of a character, they gain OC 1. So then they can perform actions. So if we have Arjak or Ragnar or the Wolfguard Battle Leader hiding in the back here in this ruin, as long as the unit can chain all the way back so that the last model in the unit is within 6 inches of this guy, they're going to be able to gain the OC1 and complete that secondary. And given the fact that the unit, because they're only 6 models, they can use 1x1 coherency so that they don't each need an extra buddy. Their capacity to string to various areas of the battlefield, plus they have a relatively high maneuverability, their movement characteristics are pretty high, is actually pretty prodigious. So they can be holding objectives from a really long way away from the character who's providing them their OC bonus. So in that case, basically these guys are a extremely cheap objective scoring unit that you are not really worried about throwing away in order to score points. It just comes with a downside that is very easily mitigated. That's why I say these guys are almost always worth it just for their capacity to score. Now, the Wolfguard Head Takers need a way to actually get to the battle. They're just a ground-pounding infantry unit, so they're not the fastest thing in the world. So we are going to be taking an Impulsor to embark them into. The Impulsor has a transport capacity of 7. It doesn't do that much. They have a firing deck, and they're able to shoot out the top with their pistols, which is cute. But for the most part, it's just going to move them up into a central position and protect them until they can get a juicy target to charge. Now, from there, we're adding some additional utility, obviously in the form of an additional scout squad, but also this Incursor squad. The Incursor squad is good for a couple reasons. First of all, it's got an okay melee profile, as well as this Meltamine that can inflict damage at the start of any phase once per game. So they're actually able to contribute a little bit of free damage to your opponent if your opponent comes in to try to deal with them. However, the other benefit is that they also support your ranged attacks. If they shoot at a target, they can grant a bonus that gives all your other shooters +1 to hit when they attack that single target, which means that even further, it's not necessary that we choose our Oath of Moment target based on who we're shooting at. Because we get rerolls from the Ballistic Dreadnoughts, we also are going to be getting potentially +1 to hit from the Incursors here as well. Which means we can choose units that, for example, the Wolfguard Terminators are going to be charging into because they don't have any rerolls baked in themselves, or even the Blood Claws to give them reroll hit rolls to hopefully shore up our melee output. So the Incursors are good in there for a couple of different reasons. Again, we're also taking some additional utility in this army to ensure that our opponent is forced to move up and deal with these utility units so that we can counterattack them with the guns and the melee. Now, speaking of the Blood Claws, let's talk about these guys, because we have double the size of the unit, so it gives us an enormous, huge brick of infantry. This unit's kind of unwieldy at some points. However, they do have the opportunity to kind of toilet bowl the game around themselves because they have the potential to do so much damage. Now, we're taking Ragnar Blackmane as the leader for the unit. And in this way, we have basically entirely redefined what this unit does. Instead of being kind of a dedicated infantry sweeper that's kind of fast, Ragnar Blackmane grants the entire unit full wound rerolls. This is because his leadership ability is normally advance and charge. However, Blood Claws naturally advance and charge already. So he has an additional effect when he joins specifically Blood Claw units. Now, Ragnar himself is also crazy good. He has 1 trillion melee attacks with sustained hits with multiple damage. So he himself is going to be able to do a ton of damage, and he does gain the effect of the leadership ability as well. So even though his strength characteristic isn't the highest, he gains those wound rerolls and can potentially chunk in for a ton. On top of that, you're also gaining an enormous number of attacks from the Blood Claws. You have 20 Blood Claws with 4 attacks each, so 80 total attacks if they're all able to get into melee, all of them with wound rerolls, potentially with hit rerolls as well if you've used Oath of Moment on the target. The combo here is to try to use Honor the Chapter in the position that these guys are getting into melee, if you're getting into melee with something that's relatively tanky, like a big vehicle. Then you're throwing 80 attacks into a target with +1 to wound, so you're wounding on 5s with everything, potentially 4s with Ragnar, with full wound rerolls as well, and +1 AP, so they all go to AP too. The damage output from this unit is, with Ragnar attached, is staggering. The weakness, obviously, is that you do have to get all 20 models in, and you need to hit that charge as well. However, it does allow you to do some weird combat chicanery if you are able to swing the unit around in different ways. I have a whole video on doing combat slingshots, which is an effect that really benefits using larger units like these. I'm not saying it's going to be useful in every situation, but definitely it is helpful to learn the charge and fight phase rules down pat when you're using large units like these. But worst case scenario, you can use them just as a huge bludgeon to beat up your opponent because they can do so much damage with all of the combos assembled. Now, from there, we've also increased the size of our Wolfguard Terminator brick, largely for the same reason. That just gives our Jack Rockfist more of a buffer before he gets killed because his melee output's really strong. And then you also get more of these AP2 2 damage melee attacks. The other thing is that these guys are an absolute boatload of wounds. Even if you take the assault cannons and the double-handed weapon on the champion, they're 37 wounds with -1 to be wounded and a 4+ feel no pain, or 4+ invulnerable save, excuse me, with a 2+ armor save on top of that. So they're just very difficult to kill for their cost. And with the character attached, can do some serious damage. So that is all of the new inclusions. Let's talk about using this list in Strikeforce games. Now, a lot of what we said of the Incursion-style games is going to be true of Strikeforce. The main thrust of the army is going to be to try to set up a position where we can stage towards the center of the battlefield, then use our utility units to try to encourage our opponent, and our ranged attacks to try to encourage our opponent to move out and attack, then counterattack them with overwhelming force. That's generally going to be the gist. However, I think this list, and in some cases, is going to use make a lot more use of strategic reserves. Now, the large brick of 20 models is a little bit of a difficult thing to utilize because you do need some very particular terrain in order to hide them. On this particular map, the one place where the Blood Claws could potentially sit safely is inside this ruin. Otherwise, they're basically large enough that your opponent's going to be able to get lines of sight to them in almost any angle if they set up centrally. If they don't put any ranged attacks on this flank, potentially, you could set them up over here maybe and then use them to push this side. However, most of the time your opponent's going to be setting up to defeat them. However, in some cases, you can find that there are very strong defensive ruins, either just outside your deployment zone or just inside your deployment zone, where you can get these guys and they can just stage and threaten the middle, as we talked about in the incursion section. In this particular case, they're a bit too big to do that safely, so while we could put them on the objective here, we could also put them in strategic reserve and basically just bank a lot of our command points to rapid ingress units. These guys are a great rapid ingress threat because they can do something like come in behind one of these line of sight blockers on the side, ensure that nobody can attack them when they rapid ingress, and then advance and charge on the subsequent turn. You can also do the same thing, obviously, with the Wolfguard Terminators, which is what I recommend. So
where you position that huge brick of guys is gonna be really impactful. Now, I also, especially in these larger games, unless you have really clean lines of sight to your opponent, I almost always recommend that you keep one Ballistic Dreadnought in reserve in order to give yourself a nice reserve threat that's able to put pressure on enemy vehicles from the flanks and force them to screen out those flanks. Now, as I mentioned before, your intercessors will almost always start on your home objective. They're then going to lock in that objective under your control at the start of your first turn, and then they can run off and go do something else. Or they can use themselves to screen out the backline if your opponent has reserves that could come in over there. They're just a nice little utility unit for that. And from there, all of the other utility is going to forward operate in positions where they can get back into cover. We can put scouts and infiltration up in the frontier and then sort of get them back behind these terrain features if you don't end up going first. And the same thing with these guys. So if we don't go first, we can push them back. If we do go first, we can push them forward to either screen the opponent and make their life difficult, or complete secondary objectives, or just sit and hold objectives and force your opponent to come and contest them. You want the Impulsor in a position where it can kind of threaten the center of the battlefield. Benefit of the Impulsor is that the disembarkation can essentially be added to your model's movement, so your units are a little bit faster than they would be otherwise. If you have larger ruins that have line of sight blocking walls that are a little bit larger than this one, you can even get the Impulsor right up into the middle here and then disembark on the other side of the wall. So when your units are disembarking, they're actually faster than they would be normally. And if you do that in Assault Doctrine, they can hop up like this and then they can advance and charge. So that's going to be a very strong threat to put pressure on your opponent. The Incursors are scouts, like the scouts themselves. However, they don't have infiltrate, so they have to deploy inside their deployment zone. But you can put them in a position where they can get up into terrain in the middle. Even if you don't go first, you can deploy them out in the open and then scout them to get behind the line of sight blocking terrain. And that allows them to then threaten some secondary play in the middle of the table on turn 2 onwards if you have it. You also then have the Hunting Wolves, which you want to set up where your Space Wolf characters are coming down so that they can then go do actions and things like that. You can also, if you objective secure your own home objective, you can use the Hunting Wolves to screen if you don't feel like you need them to perform actions or anything. And even though they don't have an OC value, that doesn't mean the objective you'll lose control of the objective because the intercessors will have objective secured it already. So you can use them to just cover your backline essentially for free and then use your other tankier units for your actual utility in the cases where your opponent is threatening your home objective like that. So a lot of little uses for the Hunting Wolves, which is why they're such a nice inclusion. But then from there, what we're trying to do is set up a situation just like the other game mode where the Wolfguard Terminators will come down. You can sort of push with the Wolfguard Head Takers on the same turn. Nice benefit of this unit being large is that they're almost always trading into something. So they'll basically kill most of the time whatever they charge, especially if they're not winning on 6s. And then kind of force your opponent to come back and swing back into them. The Blood Claws can either act as a second wave, or they can rapid ingress or come in strategic reserve on the same turn and then just sort of threaten the turn after that. You expose all of your Ballistic Dreadnoughts, get a round of shooting on your opponent, charge in with something, and engage a lot of their army, and then from there try to push out the win from that game state. But you have basically 3 of these big, huge bludgeon units that you can use in this capacity to really like beat up on your opponent with just overwhelming melee force. And you have a lot of skirmishing options available with the scouts, as well as shooting from the Ballistic Dreadnoughts and things before your opponent gives you a good target for those. The scouts having melee attacks as well is also pretty good for clearing out enemy utility stuff. So if your opponent has like guardsmen or something, a scout unit can come in, shoot them, and charge them, and have a pretty good chance of killing them, especially if you use Oath of Moment and maybe Honor the Chapter to buff their melee attacks. And that can be good to then give you more options to rapid ingress or strategic reserve these units in here. I think most of the time you would hope that the Blood Claws would not need to strategic reserve in. They do throw a little bit of a wrench in the works, but that does depend entirely on terrain, because that is one of the tough parts about playing those big, huge bricks of models. But with that, those are my recommendations for getting started with Space Wolves in 2025. Let me know down in the comment section what you think about this list. And the benefit of Space Wolves is that they are very flexible. So there are a lot of different ways to build the army if you'd like to. There's some optimization that can go into a build like this.
I was trying to use as much of the combat patrol as I could in order to make your purchases more efficient, but obviously in some cases you can sort of do some very small switches to try to optimize out your loadout as you move on. A lot of these Space Wolf special characters are also incredibly strong. This includes things like Logan Grimnar, who can command point tax enemies and even potentially allow your units to strategic reserve or to deep strike on turn 1, which catches a lot of people off guard, especially if you're able to do like funny chicanery, like deep striking on objectives or and stuff like that. Usually he'll just deep strike himself and then wander around by himself, but he's also an incredibly strong character. Bjorn the Fell-Handed is also a great one. He's a character Dreadnought who's very difficult to kill. He generates you command points as well, which can make it easier to use all your abilities. But obviously you get a lot less models if you are playing those really powerful epic heroes. There are also a lot of other builds that Space Wolves have the opportunity to hop into. Detachments like Saga of the Beast Slayer or Saga of the Bold are pretty strong from the Space Wolves supplement. They do use a unique Saga mechanic, which requires that your army completes kind of a secret achievement objective, essentially, over the course of the game before you unlock your full detachment ability. So they're a little bit more complicated, which is why I didn't start with them. But if you're looking for a little bit more Space Wolf flavor, those are good places to jump into. Otherwise, you can utilize Thunderwolf Cavalry inside the Stormlance Task Force detachment from the Space Marine Codex. That detachment is also incredibly powerful. And Thunderwolf Cavalry, another great unit to include if you'd like to. They're a very good sort of heavy infantry sweeper, but they are also a good utility unit. They're very fast, they're not very expensive, and they're hard to kill. So if you're looking for different options to expand your collection, Thunderwolf Cavalry are a great choice. But with that, that's my guide on how to start Space Wolves. Let me know down in the comment section what kind of Space Wolves army you want to build. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to Adept Roll for sponsoring this video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.